everyone, welcome to the second live stream for An Evening with Neuroscience, the Brain-Computer Interfaces stream. I'm Sharda Raina, Gray Matter's Senior Editor and your MC for today. An Evening with Neuroscience is Gray Matter's annual outreach event where we usually would have hosted some activities and demos and then had a panel of neuroscientists answer questions that the public has about the field. To make this event accessible during the quarantine, we have split this into 4 live streamed events. If you're interested in the upcoming events, the Brain Dissection will be April 17th and the panel Q&A will be May 1st. More details can be found on our Facebook and website. We will also be picking one insightful comment to receive a small gift from our sponsors, so if you are chosen, we will contact you to set that up. Please bear with us if there are any technical difficulties. To introduce today's live stream, we are going to have a couple of UW students, freshmen from the UW Academy program, give you a demo of a project that they've worked on during the year. Using the OpenBCI system, they've made a really cool brain-controlled ping pong game, which they'll talk a bit about and demo during their presentation. To start things off, though, we'll show you some brain signals and take any audience suggestions to see real-time brainwaves. Please welcome Nicholas, Sage, and James.
Hey, thank you so much for joining tonight. Really excited to have you here with us. And thanks so much for giving us a little bit of your time out of your day. Really excited to demonstrate Brain Pong for you tonight. As you can see here, and as we like to say, Brain Pong is traditional Pong with a modern twist. Actually, it's a Pong game that you can control from your brain. And so the way that we're going to structure this live stream is I'm going to briefly go through some of the concepts, both from a technology side and then also from a scientific perspective through Brain Pong. And then my colleague Nicholas, who's here with me on this live stream, is actually going to demo Brain Pong for you. But in addition to demoing Brain Pong, he's also going to take some audience suggestions as to things you can potentially try out with a brain-computer interface. So pay attention during the live stream and keep on typing in the chat what you want Nicholas to do, because at the end of the day, he is your puppet. So without further ado, let's jump right into the presentation. My name is Sage Kanuja. As Sharda mentioned, I'm a freshman through the Robinson Center program, early entrance student, and I'm studying computer science and business.
Yeah, so my name is Nicholas Ioannou. I'm also a Robinson Center student, freshman at the University of Washington. I'm studying computer science. And unfortunately, one of our partners, James Wu, he couldn't make it here tonight. But he's also freshman at University of Washington, studying computer science. You'll hear from me a little bit later when I do the demo for Brain Pong. But for now, Sage will take over.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nick, for the intro. And right now, really excited to jump into, why did we even, decide to build Brain Pong? And so, at the high level, playing Pong with your brain, it's a fun concept. It's a cool concept. But we know that a lot of the technology that we develop for Brain Pong can be actually applied to legitimate neuroscience research and neurological research. And so, that was one of the big motivations developing this project, because, you look at the number of people across the world and in the US who have these terrible neurological diseases. And one of our paramount focuses, just because personally, one of my close friends, his grandmother was diagnosed with progressive supranuclear palsy. And I noticed, how she, she turned from a, really active woman into someone who was struggling to perform daily tasks. And, so it was really important for me, Pong, we've built the Pong game, but in addition, as you'll see throughout our presentation, we want to emphasize that what we've developed is not just applied to Pong. It can be applied to legitimate research on these neurological diseases, in terms of, recognizing and potentially early diagnosis of someone with Alzheimer's or other neurological diseases. So we just wanted to preface with that. And so again, these many people suffer from neurological, neurodegenerative diseases. And so what the technology that we've developed enables us to do is, as I mentioned, early detection, and really understanding them, right? Because what your brain is doing is essentially a ton of electrical signal. And so for us, we're trying to find out how to interpret that signal. And how we interpret that signal is through a solution which has been developed quite recently over the past 10, 20, 30 years, and at a very high level, we are using kind of two main tools that are, number one, EEG, which is essentially a test that detects electrical activity in your brain using small metal discs called electrodes, which are attached to your scalp. And so that sounds like a handful, but just keep that in mind. And actually, Nicholas, my colleague who's on the live stream, will actually a demo Brain Pong later on, and through hands-on, what the BCI looks like and the different components. And that kind of segues me into brain-computer interface, another one of the tools which we're using for this project, which is both a hardware and software communication system that can read a certain set of patterns in brain signals and using them to control computers or external devices. So essentially what that means is brain-computer interface can read some of the electrical signal that's going on in your brain and transmit that data to your computer so you can actually interpret that data. And so, as we'll show you later, again, and you'll actually get the chance to see this legitimate electrical data later in a number format, and as you'll see, it's extremely hard to uncover these seemingly hidden patterns in data. And so another one of the tools which has been essential in developing Brain Pong has been the use of machine learning, as we're able to essentially discover hidden patterns in data, because that's what machine learning does. It essentially simulates a human brain which has read through all of these. Machine learning is actually able to act like someone who's extremely experienced in reading these EEG signals, and I'll go a little bit more into that later on. So, kind of jumping back to BCIs, brain-computer interfaces, there are two main types of brain-computer interfaces that are out there today. There are external brain-computer interfaces. As you can see, the lady on at least my left is wearing, and what she is, what she is, the function of the BCI on her head is actually used for early diagnosis of Alzheimer's. And you can see the BCI is on top of her head. It's like a turtle-like shell. And additionally, there's a internal BCI, which is actually implanted in your brain. And example of this being used in the wild is for people with paralysis, empowering them to communicate with the outside world. In this case through typing. So those are a little bit about the two types of BCIs. So now we kind of know a little bit about kind of the tools in our toolkit in order to build Brain Pong. But let's explore a little bit of the neuroscience and relevant science behind Brain Pong, because with the tools, we have the tools, but unless we know the science, we can't combine the power of both of them to create an effective solution. So, how do BCIs work? I kind of highlighted this a little bit before, but essentially, there's electrodes which sit on top of, either they're implanted or they're on top of your brain and on your scalp. In our case, they're going to be nothing's implanted, but what they serve very similar functionality, which is you have these cells in your brains called neurons. And so very simply put, neurons are able to communicate with each other through electrical activity. And each part of your brain has a different function, right? So, one part of the brain can be used for processing images and vision. Another part of the brain can be used for moving your arm, etc. And so what we're trying to do is use our BCI with these many electrodes, not just one, that are placed in specific spots over your scalp, where it's been proven that there's predicted activity, such as like if you move your hand, it'll excite neurons in that specific area in the brain. And so what we're able to do actually is have these electrodes that are placed in these specific places on your scalp and interpret that data and recognize different patterns, as we'll see later. So again, these are like the different types of brain waves, but this is like terminology over here. But the key point to remember is that there's different sort of brain waves for different functions. And as you can see here, there's like delta waves for unconscious functions, theta waves for emotions, alpha waves for idle thought, beta for conscious thought, and gamma for complex thought. And you'll get a little bit, you'll get a hands-on demo with Nicholas shortly, where you can actually see the difference between, for example, if you're thinking calmly or if you're doing a math problem or watching a video. So that should be something really cool. So this is just a brief diagram visualizing the brain data. So actually, as you can see, I believe Nick was moving his hand or doing some sort of movement, and as you can see, we captured what his brain activity looked like, and as you can see, a very specific part of the brain was activated, and it's actually really cool to see live. And this is a sneak peek, but the real demo is yet to come. So we know a little bit now about the tools that we're using to build Brain Pong, and we also know a little bit about the relative science. And so now we can actually mesh those together to really understand, what was our methodology when we were developing Brain Pong. So what we did was obviously, we had the brain-computer interface. And specifically, in the first version of Brain Pong that we built, we used an open BCI. And with our latest version, we use a device called the Muse, which Nicholas will demonstrate to you later. But essentially, they serve the same purpose, which is, they read data from your brain, electrical activity and data from that. And based on, the data that we read from your brain, and certain parts of your brain, because these electrodes are scattered all over your scalp, what we're able to do is use a combination of machine learning to actually predict what you're thinking. So which direction are you trying to think, and accordingly the Pong paddle will move. And then we also have a few other functionalities which we'll demo later tonight, which is about if you blink, we can detect that. And obviously, once your data has been crunched and passed through our machine learning, and it says, hey, Nick or Sage is thinking up or Sage is thinking down, we're able to use that output to control the Pong game. So I'm going to go through kind of a little bit of the tests that we did when developing Brain Pong. But actually, Nick will show you this in person very soon. And that should be really exciting. So the first test that we did was, visual disparity in terms of meditation versus intense thinking. So could you see a difference? The second test that we did was, blinking eyes versus raising eyebrows. Or staying still. And the third test that we did was, thinking up or down, because we wanted to kind of see if there was a difference. So we could build some sort of algorithm that could interpret that data and then, say, hey, you should move the Pong paddle up or down. And then the fourth test that we did that Nick will actually demo to you is based, after building our machine learning, we evaluated its performance.
Hey guys, just hold on a moment as we're switching interpreters.
Awesome.
And I think we're good to go.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sharda. As I was saying, we did several tests, and just to remind you, test one was, blinking, to see if there was if it actually worked, right? Did the brain-computer interface actually pick up when you blinked? And actually, you can see, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, but kind of toward the left third of the diagram, there's a very visual spike that you can see, and that is someone blinking. And so we were really excited by this, and we'll show you this later, in fact. But that was an amazing test for us, just to see, hey, we got the BCI set up and it's working properly. So successful results. The second test that we did was meditation versus watching a video, right? When you're watching a video, your brain is actually going to be thinking. So a lot of your neurons are going to be activated in processing the video, etc. And so, as you can see, the top diagram is someone who's meditating. As you can see, the brain activity is fairly flat. But then, obviously, when you're watching a video, gets a lot more choppy, which indicates that you're actually thinking. And so the conclusion from that, again, was we got successful results. And I can just move my Zoom so you can see. All right. And so, before I had mentioned to you, what does, you've seen in the graphs what this data looks like, but this is the data which is showing up on the graphs. And this is from all the different electrodes placed on your brain. And so for me to look at that, even as someone who's studied the basics of neuroscience, I can't tell you what that means, to be honest with you. So that's a reality. Unless I frankly have no idea how you would interpret that as a human being. So instead of trying to achieve that endeavor, what we did was we said, hey, we're computer science guys, and we should try to build a machine learning solution to this, which actually simulates like someone thinking, except our machine learning has been trained on millions upon millions of samples of this data. So imagine if you've read all millions of samples, you'd be pretty darn good at identifying what's up or down, pretty much. And so that's exactly what we did. And so we're almost to the demo, but I just want to kind of close this presentation by saying, yeah, like Brain Pong is awesome, and it's obviously you're going to see in the demo it's a very cool technology. But I truly believe that brain-computer interfaces are one of the revolutionary technologies of my generation. You look at Elon Musk and Neuralink, where they're trying to make information downloadable. Like, what if you can essentially download entire calculus into your brain and know it? You don't even have to study for like 3-4 years. So that's kind of some of the innovation in the field that's going on right now. But as I mentioned before, again, like BCIs, there's extensive research going on, which is, hey, how can we do early detection of these neurodegenerative diseases? As I mentioned, kind of this Neuralink example where you can actually download info to your brain. Those are really, really awesome and cool, and they're going to have a lot of positive impact, those innovations. But something that we all have to be mindful of, and one thing that I want you guys to take away from this stream is that this technology is immensely powerful. If someone has a BCI implanted in their brain and they get hacked, that is not a good situation. And so it's really important to be mindful going forward. Yes, it's an incredible, powerful technology, but we also have to be mindful that it's an incredibly powerful technology and make sure, from an ethical standpoint, that everything is set before before unleashing its full power. So with that, I'll kind of turn it off to Nick, and I'm really excited for you guys to see the demo.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sage. Just going to switch up the screens here. Just bear me. And I think that should be good. So we have a few interesting demos planned for today, and I just want to give you kind of a table of contents here. But just to have this thinking in the back of your mind, at the very end, we will be able to be taking some suggestions for what other demos. If you guys have any ideas, we can definitely try them out. So for the first demo, we want to kind of actually look at what my brainwaves look like when I am meditating versus when I am interacting, speaking, thinking, these kinds of things. Next, we will look at my EEG data when I do some kind of action. And we're keeping them low level, things like blinking, raising your eyebrows, clenching your jaw, these kinds of things. And so we'll see how that actually impacts my EEG data. And finally, we'll kind of pull all that together. And we've developed we've developed the actual Pong game, and we'll demo that. So let's first get into the first demo. So let's first come up with a hypothesis here. So, when we think about meditation, I think that there's going to be a lot less neurological activity. And so to me, I would think that I'd expect to see a lot less waves, so more flat curve. Whereas with social interaction, you'd do a lot more thinking, and need to be a lot more neurological activity. And therefore, I would expect to see more waves. And so, just one last thing before we get into the actual demo, I kind of wanted to introduce everyone to the actual BCI that I'm using. And you might be surprised to see that this is it. This is it. It's a super sleek device. And that kind of goes to show the evolution of the field. I mean, 10 years ago, BCIs were only accessible in the lab. You had to have 50 electrodes all over your head. And now there's a commercially available device that anybody can buy, and get the same exact technology and experiment with it themselves. So now let's just get right into the demo here. So first I'll power up the BCI here, and then connect to it on my device. And you can just see that this is all super simple. It just takes a quick second to connect. So this is called the Muse. And while that's connecting, I can actually put it on my head. So basically, I just strap it around my ears like this, and it'll be touching my forehead. And just like that, it is connected, and that's what it looks like. As you can see, it's streaming. So now what we'll do is let's actually start looking at my brainwaves. So what I'll do is I'll run the script, and it takes a quick second to open up. And there we go. So you can see that these first four kind of waves here, that's actually my brain waves. And before we actually get into our hypothesis, I think it's pretty interesting to look at these. And so we can look at these second and third ones here. Though each of these waves here are corresponding to electrodes on my brain-computer interface. So the first two waves are actually electrodes that are right here, looking at my frontal lobe. And while the first and the fourth one are electrodes that are actually behind my ear. And so now you can see I'm talking, I'm doing a lot of thinking, and we can actually kind of see that we can see kind of like a little. Let me just adjust the BCI really quickly here. So perfect. So now I will perform, stop talking and kind of get into a more meditative state, and you'll see that the waves drop significantly. So I'll just do that right now. So as you can see, for that period of time, the waves were significantly, they didn't have any spikes or anything. As soon as I started talking, there was an immediate jump. And so that kind of proves our hypothesis that when we're actually interacting socially, we see more waves from the EEG. So I will now just quit out of that. And let's get on to the next demo. So let's think about, now we're starting to think a little bit about, cues. And so that could be something like blinking, clenching your jaw, raising your eyebrows, or any other actual, physical movement that causes some kind of spike like this. And the idea is that what you can do is whenever a spike occurs, or whenever you kind of trigger that spike to occur by doing a movement like blinking, you can check if the EEG data reaches a certain threshold. So you can see that when the spike occurred, it crossed a certain line here. And then you can say, well, when that happens, you can trigger something to happen. And so that's one way that we can actually interact with technology with our brain. And so basically, as I was saying, when you reach that threshold, do something on the computer. So let's see it in action. First, before that, I just want to show everybody the actual spikes. So let's just do that right now. And you can see actually on my face before when I'm blinking. And actually, I'll be raising my eyebrows because that's what's going to be happening in the demo. So we'll see that right now. And that, as you can see, there's a huge spike. And there's another one. And so now let's actually implement this in a game of Pong or Brain Pong. So to do that, I will just run the basic game here. And basically the way that it works, I'll just pause it for now, but the way that it works is whenever I raise my eyebrows or blink my eyes, the paddle will change direction. So it'll start moving upwards, I believe upwards, and then when I raise my eyebrows, it'll change direction. And with that, I can actually play against the opponent here. And one thing I should mention before I play the game, we've programmed this opponent to be actually impossible to beat. So don't get your expectations too high before I go into it. So let's just see how that looks. Perfect. So you could see that whenever I was raising my eyebrows, basically, in the actual code, we were detecting when the spike occurred, and when we detected that, we changed the direction of the ping pong paddle. So let's get into the next demo here. So just give it a second to load here. So now, you could see that those huge spikes whenever I was raising my eyebrows or blinking, right? And I think that's definitely something it's definitely cool to see that, and it could be useful in some contexts. But I think it's a little bit tedious to raise your eyebrows every time you want something to happen. And so the solution to that is to develop algorithms that detect more complex cues, right? So something a little bit less or a little bit more abstract than just a spike. And
Hey, Nick.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Just switching between our amazing interpreters again.
Great.
And I think you should be good to go in about 5 or so seconds.
Okay. Just let me know.
I think you're good.
Awesome. So let me just move this Zoom box down so that you guys can see these numbers. So as I was saying, there's lots of more complex cues that would be more valuable for us to detect. And as Sage was mentioning, the way that we can do that is through actual machine learning. And this is kind of a sample here. And I think Sage, you showed this image before, but at the top here, this is the actual numbers we get when we're thinking up, and this is the numbers we get when we're thinking down. And unlike the spike that we saw in the EEG data and the waves, there's really nothing that sets these apart to the human eye. And so that's where this becomes a very good task for machine learning. And let's just go through a little bit of how machine learning works at a very high level. And the process that we underwent was we started by gathering a ton of data. And so what I mean by that is we started gathering those numbers when I was thinking up, and then we gathered a bunch of those numbers when I was thinking down. And by a bunch, I mean millions of samples. Next, we basically created a kind of predictive model and with a set of rules that was able to correlate thinking up, the numbers of thinking up with the actual concept of thinking up. And on the other hand, the actual numbers produced by thinking down with the idea of thinking down. So just to reiterate, we were able to correlate, these numbers, which are thinking up, with thinking down, with thinking up, and these numbers, which are thinking down, with actually thinking down. And just so I can move the box out of the way so you can read here. But we basically refined our predictive model by supplying all the data that we collected. And then we used the actual predictive model in our Brain Pong game to be able to actually play the game when we were in our Brain Pong demo with our brain by thinking up and down. So let's see that. And one thing that's actually important to note is, of course, at this moment right now, our actual blink detection or raising our eyebrow detection is more accurate than actual thinking up and down. And that makes a lot of sense because thinking up and down is a super abstract concept. Whereas, raising your eyebrows is something that, as we saw, it's very simple to detect that. And so, it's a little bit harder to play Pong with that, but we were still able to get a kind of basic version going. And you'll see that in just a second here. Oh, and by the way, now is the time to start asking questions in the chat. Any questions you might have about our presentation, we can answer them. Or if you want to suggest a demo that we can do, maybe look back at the EEG waves and suggest a few things that we can do. That's great as well. So now I'll get into the actual Pong game by controlling it by just thinking up and down. So let's get into that. Okay, so now the game is paused. I'll just move the box out of the way so it's a little bit easier to see. And I'll have to remain quiet, but maybe Sage, if you want, can narrate over. And let's go ahead.
Yeah, so as you guys can kind of see, it's fairly accurate given that it's such an abstract concept of thinking up or down, and thinking, and then translating that to the Pong game. But again, the way that we've been able to do that is through collecting millions of samples of Nick actually playing Pong, and building our rules to our machine learning based on him specifically. So I think the key learning here is that everyone's brain data is super unique, and so we specifically trained our Pong game with a lot of samples of Nick, and so it wouldn't work on me, for example. And the way to make it work on me is to train our model with many samples from a lot of different people, and because essentially, as we mentioned, what machine learning is doing is it's crunching all of that huge, big. It's so large, the data set. They even call it big data. And so what the ML is doing is it's crunching that data together, and then allowing us to predict. Simulating a human is actually read through all of that data, and predict kind of what's going to happen next.
Yeah, so that was kind of the demo. And as you can see, it wasn't perfect. Obviously, I'm not going to win against an impossible to win against bot, but I think did pretty well. Actually getting to the ball. And another thing to note is that we started this project 4 or 5 months ago, and back then it was really difficult to actually control the Pong game. I mean, it wasn't accurate at all. It was we basically couldn't get to the ball. We could only get to the ball like 25% of the time. But now after improving the model over and over and countless hours doing that, you could see that it was pretty accurate in detecting whether I was thinking up or down. And so we're really proud to have developed out that technology.
Best experience for you guys obviously would have been to come try it out live in person, and we wish we could make that happen, because it's just so magical when you actually realize that you're able to move something with your brain. But we hope that we were able to channel some of that energy and excitement through Zoom in this case. So with that kind of wrapping up, what our planned portion of the event, we'd love to jump into, a few questions, or, people want us to do, various things with the BCI. We can just go ahead and jump to that. So yeah. So I guess I can kind of read off some of the questions that we're seeing in the chat. So the first question is from Julia, and the question is, why is the spike for raising your eyebrows so large when it does not seem like there are large spikes when you're talking?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to ask these kinds of questions. That's a really good question. And I think, the answer to that, and I'm not sure if I can give a full answer just because there's so much that we have to learn about the brain, but the answer is that my understanding is that certain things trigger the brain differently. And my understanding is that because the sensors are placed right above the eyebrows, there's a stronger correlation with that over just speaking. Sage, do you want to add anything?
No, I think that's a good answer. I think let's move on to the next question from Terry, who is wondering, and Nick, this is on you, buddy. Terry says, I wonder if singing versus regular speaking leads to different brainwaves.
Okay, so we'll get into that. We can give that a shot.
So while Nick is kind of pulling it up, we also have a question that's asking us to, in addition to singing, snap with your fingers, and seeing Chloe says, can you do it with snapping your fingers for a direction change for the Pong game?
Sure, Sage, do you want to answer that while I'm just setting this up here?
Yeah, I think, we can definitely do it. I think one thing that'll be interesting is to see how snapping affects your brain waves, as we're going to demo right now, based on Terry's question of, whether singing affects it or not. So definitely, we can give that a shot.
All right, so as you can see, the Muse is just connecting right now.
And so while the Muse is connecting, Chloe asks another question, which is, how long did it take to collect all the data? And the answer to that, I mean, it took a few months. Again, like there's millions of samples over here. So, I mean, we weren't like working on this, like, again, like 8 hours a day, like full time for the past 4 or 5 months. But, there's been kind of a marinating effect of being able to collect, bunch of samples every week. And, as obviously, if you do that every week for a couple of months, they add up and, you're able to build a pretty good machine learning model from them. And yeah, so I would say a couple of months. And, one more question before we head over to looking at the brain waves was from Terry saying, how many data points did your machine learning setup need to reliably learn up versus down? Nick, do you want to answer this?
Yeah, for sure. So, I think to answer that question, it's worth going into a little bit about how the actual data collection works. So basically, when we're wearing this Muse, it'll collect, I believe it's around 2,000 data points per second. So 2,000 kind of frames per second. So just like when you record a video on your phone, and that's kind of like taking, a picture every, 0.001 seconds or something like that. We collect around 2,000 of those per second. And with that, I think the final was, we had around 2.5 million data points. So someone can do the math, but that is probably hours of just, thinking up and thinking down and recording that. But I'd love to get into a little bit more of the demos here. Please note, I'm not the best singer, so I'll just be singing like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star or something like that. So now we'll just run the viewer here.
Yeah, maybe you can do a little bit of talking to see the difference, because that was the kind of meat of the question.
Sure. Yeah, I'll start with talking. So as we can see, here is talking, and let me just change the sensitivity here. So this is talking, and as you can see, when I put like more emphasis into words, you can kind of see a spike, like, over here when I was talking. So just for just to reference, I'll now meditate a little bit, and then I'll do some singing. Okay, so now I'll just sing like a little bit of like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. So twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. Okay, so that's an interesting question, actually. We actually haven't tried that. And, I think actually all these spikes, and like I was saying before, it's really hard to interpret these because there's so much to be figured out about the brain. But, I think maybe a lot of these spikes were happening because, I was nervous. Like, I'm not the best singer. Like I said, I was nervous. Like my heart rate went up. And the Muse actually also has a heart rate sensor on it. But, now I've calmed down a little bit, you can see. And
leave it kind of meditating a bit while I read out this next question.
Yeah, should we try the snapping demo first? Or?
Yeah, let's try the snapping demo.
Yeah, and I think just before that, we will be having another interpreter switch, but you guys can continue talking.
Okay, so I guess I can, Nick, you can just try snapping.
Okay, so Oh wow, that's interesting. So as you can see, like everything is super correlated in the brain, and whenever I snapped, you could actually visibly see on the EEG data here that there was a visible spike.
Only detecting Nicholas actually making the muscle movement, but another thing to consider here is our body is super interconnected. So as soon as he snaps, we're going to hear the snap. And so your brain has to process that, and that's explanation for potential spike. Cool. So moving on, we have a comment from Madeline, which is saying, I think it is important to point out that the spikes you are seeing for eye blink or other facial movement is more likely the EEG data detecting the electrical activity of the muscles, not brain. Madeline, you are definitely right. A lot of the I would say that that's definitely the case. And actually, just by nature of having the Zoom demo, we were actually planning to have Nick stomp his foot or something, but just wanted to demo something that would be slightly more visible. And just to confirm, you can see when you snap your fingers or something. While the eyebrows is definitely a valid point, throughout, if you make a muscle movement, you can definitely see correlation in between those spikes.
Right, and another thing to note is in our actual eyebrow raising demonstration with actual Brain Pong, we actually do a lot of artifact pre-processing, and so what that means is that we're ensuring that we're doing our best to kind of take out any of the facial muscle movement by applying filters to this data, and so that we can really get kind of the raw brain data, if that makes sense.
Cool. Awesome. So we have another comment from or question from Valerie asking, I'm curious if it could become more accurate if instead of thinking up and thinking down, you associated up and down with specific concepts or images, like an up or down arrow or the sky or ground. Nick, do you want to handle that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that these are all very valid experiments to do, and there's been a lot of research that has shown that the brain makes these strong correlations with visual stuff more than these abstract thoughts, and that's definitely something that we're planning to look into and do in the future.
For sure. And, for any of you that are, looking at the demo and saying, hey, this is something really cool and I want to try it out as well. You can actually purchase one of these BCIs, a Muse specifically for, I think it's like $150 to $200, somewhere in that range. Might even be cheaper for some older generations that will still work. And if you buy that, we can potentially make it, we can coordinate with the Evening with Neuroscience people and make it super easy for you to get set up if that's of interest. So drop it in the comments below if you're interested. And that's kind of also Nathan's comment, which is usually using the visualization for sky or ground may aid in thinking up or down. Yes, that's definitely something that we and we'd really encourage you to experiment with. Let's see. Okay, so another question from Valerie, from her family actually. How would we be able to play Brain Pong if the BCI is tuned to Nick's brainwaves?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So Sage touched on it a little bit earlier, but I'd love to go a little bit more in depth on that. Basically, the Brain Pong, you're right. It's right now it's tuned to my brain, and one thing that we've discovered throughout this whole process is that it doesn't exactly cross over. Where if Brain Pong is trained to recognize my brainwaves, I can't just put the BCI on Sage and it'll work completely the same. There's some correlation, but the overall accuracy that we found was a lot less. And so the way that you'd be able to play would be go through the similar process of collecting data of yourself thinking up and down, and then what we would do is we would train our predictive model, on your data. So you can think about now it not only knows my brain, but it'll know your brain as well. Yeah, Sage, do you want to add anything there?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. We have a question coming from Jay, which says, if you wink one eye versus the other, does it appear in different channels? Because for those of you who are not familiar, different sides of the brain, your left side of your brain controls the right side of your body and vice versa. So he wants to have you blink with one eye and then also raise an eyebrow.
Sure. So I can just blink with my left eye first. So there's my left eye and there's my right eye. One thing to note is that because this is the raw EEG data coming from the Muse directly, someone else mentioned it, but it is actually picking up on my facial muscle movement. So a lot of the time when you blink your eye here, you will it'll actually pick up on the actual muscular movement of me, moving my face to wink my eye. And so that's why you see these like huge spikes. Whereas when we actually applied our facial artifact pre-processing, the spike is still visible, but it's definitely not as as big as these ones shown here.
Cool. Awesome. So we have a question from Valerie asking, what about sign languages? And are the waves different for signing than speaking? And I see a note from one of our admins saying, don't make up sign languages. But luckily, Nick just did a project on sign languages, so hopefully he remembers a few. You want to give that a shot?
Yeah, sure. So basically, I can just do. I know a few of the sign language letters from another project that I did regarding BCIs, but we can try that now. So as you can see, there were some significant spikes. With of course with these EEG data here, it's pretty difficult to kind of associate a specific spike on the EEG wave with an exact motion that you're doing, because there's so much other stuff going on in your body, right? So it could be that whenever I am doing the sign language symbol with my hand, I might be doing something else, and that's what that actual spike could be caused by. And so that adds another layer of complexity, because with Brain Pong, we had to kind of actually figure out if these actions were actually correlated with the actions that we were doing.
Cool. So now we have a question from Daniel asking, would someone thinking up in a different language have a similar effect to thinking in English for the long game? So Nick, I know you're a little bilingual. So I don't know if you want to think in, I don't know, Norwegian or Spanish or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing to note is that as we were kind of mentioning before, I'm not sure, because because the actually thinking up and down is such an abstract thought, it actually doesn't show up in the EEG data here. So even if I think up in English, you won't actually be able to see it here. But I think that your question is really interesting, because it's kind of asking, when we were collecting the data of us thinking up and down, what does that really mean? What does thinking up and down really mean? Does it mean thinking of the word up and thinking of the word down, or does it mean thinking of the concept up or thinking of the concept down? Or maybe it could even be thinking about maybe ascending in an airplane versus descending in an airplane. So there's lots of other ways to interpret it, and I think it's really interesting to run those kinds of experiments.
Cool. And so we have one final comment from Daniel, which is saying, I wonder if those spikes were because Nicholas was translating in his head.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting thing to think about. And I think that, there's, I mean, one thing that you have to consider is that since we're picking up data directly from the brain, there's a lot of hidden signals that we're actually picking up, right? So, even though I can lower, right now I'm using my scroll wheel to actually change the amplitude of the waves and the sensitivity. But, even in this, like, still when I blink, you can see a little spike here. But even in this data that looks super flat, if I zoom in on it a lot, you can see that there's some really complex patterns going on. And so it's oftentimes in those that some of the more complex abstract thinking is occurring. And so that's why I think it has such a huge potential in this field, because there's really no way to program an algorithm, just hard code an algorithm that is going to kind of detect, these really subtle patterns, but machine learning is able to uncover it on its own. Yeah.
Awesome. So that kind of wraps up all of our kind of Q&A session. We'd really, on behalf of not only me and Nicholas and in the Brain Pong team, but as well as the Gray Matters team, we'd really like to thank you for spending some time with us tonight. Hopefully, learning something interesting, and really, something that we'd like you to take away is again, BCIs are going to be a critical part of the future. And so, hopefully now you'll be empowered, as some of the tools, some of the science, little bit of everything, and overall have a pretty good holistic understanding as a result. Again, a couple of years ago, BCIs were inaccessible. Like, again, we're 16-year-old students, so like in order for us to purchase a BCI like 10 years ago, we couldn't have done it because it costed thousands upon thousands of dollars. But today, companies like OpenBCI, Muse have cut the cost tremendously, and so if you just search MUSE or OpenBCI, OpenBCI online, you can get access to some of those tools, and we'd really encourage you to try those out, specifically those of you who are interested in kind of the demos that happened today, and you want to run your own experiments. It's been a really fantastic experience. Walking you through, our project, and again, really appreciate you sticking around, and thank you so much.